Welcome back. Last week we finished our series on the relationship between economic forces and mental illness. Now you know why so many more young people are becoming mentally ill. We can move on to talking about how so many of them end up in jail, but to do that, we need to talk about what jail is. So this will be part one of a two-part crash course on the basics of jails and mental health. We'll start with jails today, and we'll cover mental health basics in the next one. Now, what a jail is in theory, what a jail is in the movies, and what a jail is in actuality are not always the same thing. For example, in the movies, you see a guy charged with murder, and then in the next scene, he's in court for a jury trial. This is extremely inaccurate. It usually takes a year or more for someone charged with murder to get to trial. I've seen it take 5 years. So here we go. Jail 101. In the US, crimes are divided into 3 tiers. Felonies are the most serious crimes, and all felony convictions can come with sentences of a year or more in jail or prison. Misdemeanors are less serious, and sentences can range from 30 days to 1 year in jail. Then you have ordinance violations, which rarely involve any jail time. If you're found guilty of an ordinance violation, usually you just pay a fine. One thing that's important to know is that the seriousness of a charge doesn't necessarily line up with how dangerous a behavior is. For instance, DUI is extremely dangerous and usually classified as a misdemeanor. Meanwhile, in some states, possession of marijuana will get you charged with a felony. Another important caveat is that due to how the justice system works, a person may end up serving significantly more or less time in jail than sentencing guidelines suggest. I've seen people plead guilty to a felony and walk away without any jail time. I've also seen people try to fight a misdemeanor charge and end up detained between jail and the state hospital system for more than a year. That exceeds what, on paper, is supposed to be the maximum sentence for a misdemeanor, even though no judge ever technically sentenced them to more than a year. The reason this matters for us is that the people who tend to spend a lot of time in jail for relatively minor offenses are almost always the ones who are struggling with mental illness. Next, jail versus prison. People sometimes use these terms interchangeably when they are in fact very different facilities. Jails are short-term holding facilities. They're designed primarily to hold people who have been charged with a crime, but who are presumed innocent until their case is disposed. Prisons, on the other hand, are long-term holding facilities that hold people who've been convicted of a felony. The key for us, because we're mostly talking about jails, is the fact that jails have an extremely rapid turnover. For example, in my jail, the average length of stay is about 48 hours. In a 24-hour period, we could book and release 100 inmates. Now, part of the reason for this turnover is that when you're arrested, the arresting officer has to file charges with the prosecutor's office. The state cannot hold you without probable cause, which basically means that there's at least some evidence that the police had justification to arrest you. If the court does not determine within 48 hours of your arrest that probable cause exists, then the jail has to release you. I'm telling you this now because it'll be relevant later when we talk about seriously mentally ill people who get booked into the jail and then released 48 hours later. So this type of high churn, high turnover environment presents a lot of challenges from a mental health standpoint. Jails are noisy, chaotic, confusing, stressful, and sometimes dangerous places to be. This makes things difficult for both inmates and the mental health staff who are trying to diagnose and treat them. We're going to talk a lot about this later. The next thing you need to know about is bail. If you know how a pawn shop works, then you basically know how bail works. Basically, the court looks at your case and determines how much of a danger you are to the community and how likely you are to return to court if you're released. Based on this little algorithm, the judge sets a bail amount. It might be $500 for a minor crime or $50,000 or more for something serious. In order to get out of jail, someone has to give this amount of money to the court as collateral. If you fail to come back to court at your scheduled court date, the court can keep this money. This creates an incentive for people to come back to court. Now, if the court decides that you pose a substantial danger to society or that you're a flight risk, then your judge can deny you bail. This basically means that you're stuck in jail and no amount of money can get you out until your case is resolved. At this point, if you're reading between the lines, you may have noticed that it's easier to get out of jail if you have money. A lot of people who come to jail are homeless or indigent, and even a $500 bail is not feasible for them. There is a lot of debate about the ethics of cash bail, but we'll save that for another video. For now, just notice that the people who are most likely to be disadvantaged by the bail system are people with mental illness. And once again, this is because people who are seriously mentally ill are often indigent and significantly more likely to be homeless than other inmates. Since they can't afford bail, they tend to spend a lot more time in jail than everyone else. Next, let's talk about plea deals. When you're watching Law & Order, you're always seeing people go to trial, there's a jury, the person is either convicted or acquitted, when in real life, trials are rare. Nationally, criminal trials only happen in about 2% of cases. In my jurisdiction, it's even less common. 99.5% of cases in my jurisdiction are resolved without a trial. The reason for this is that almost everyone takes a plea deal. A plea deal is when a defendant agrees to admit to a crime, usually a lesser crime if they're facing multiple charges, in exchange for dismissal of more serious charges and/or a more lenient sentence. In my experience, there are two main reasons why plea deals are so popular. First, jury trials are extremely expensive. And remember, this is secretly an economics channel, so always pay attention to the money no matter what we're talking about. When a case goes to trial, the judge has to clear her schedule for a few days, which means that none of the other people in the hundreds of other cases the judge has can have hearings on those days. It also means that the state is going to have to pay for a prosecutor to research the case, prep for the case, and argue the case. If the defendant has a public defender, the state has to pay for all of the same casework for a second attorney as well. Between all of this, even a basic jury trial is going to cost the taxpayer tens of thousands of dollars. And you might be doing all of this over someone stealing a single bottle of liquor. So given the extreme cost of conducting a trial, the state has an incentive to avoid going to trial. Oh, and imagine what would happen if they spend all that money on a trial and then they lost. The taxpayer tends to see this as a waste of resources, which is politically dangerous for whatever prosecutor took the case to trial. But again, this is a topic for another video. The second reason plea deals are popular is that ordinary people can't afford to sit in jail for a month. I mean, would your employer be cool with you just not showing up to work for a month because you're in jail? Probably not. So let's say you're in jail on a charge of misdemeanor disorderly conduct. If you can afford bail, then no problem. But 60% of Americans can't afford $500 in cash bail. So if this is your situation, you are highly incentivized to take a plea deal. You could choose to spend 60 or 90 days in jail fighting your case, but considering that you're going to lose your job, which means you're not going to be able to pay your rent or your car note, fighting your case is sort of irrational from a survival standpoint. And also consider that sometimes people are arrested when they have kids at home, or pets, or take care of a disabled family member. These people have serious obligations and have to do whatever it takes to get out of jail. In a lot of cases, it makes sense to plead guilty to a crime you didn't commit because the real cost of fighting your case is higher than the cost of taking the misdemeanor. Now, let's talk about probation, parole, and holds. Probation is a court-ordered sentence where the court allows someone to remain in the community with supervision by a probation officer. It's kind of like the court letting you off with a warning. However, if you violate the terms of your probation, the court can impose consequences which can involve bringing you back to jail. In contrast, parole is a way to let people out of prison early to allow them back into the community with supervision. They're both forms of community supervision, but the main difference is whether the person is avoiding jail time or prison time. Another thing you need to know is that the police sometimes arrest people for charges that were filed in other jurisdictions. For instance, if you did a burglary in New York and you flee the state, then the court will issue a warrant for your arrest. If you then get picked up in, say, Texas, the police can run your name and find out that you have a warrant out of New York. The jail in Texas will then contact New York to see if they want to come and get you and bring you back there to face your criminal charges. If this happens, you can be incarcerated in Texas on a hold, while New York figures out if they want to bring you back. When you have a hold, the jurisdiction in which you have an outstanding warrant has a certain amount of time to come and get you. In my jail, these holds are for 30 days. If they don't make plans to come and get you within that time, then the local jail has to let you go. As a general rule, most states don't want to travel across the country to pick someone up unless that person has a serious charge. For a burglary, like in our example, they might extradite you for that. But if your charge was something like trespassing or misdemeanor theft, they're not going to bother. This is because extraditing people is expensive. Remember, the justice system runs on money. Now, to the heart of the issue. Why are we concerned specifically about mental health in jails? Well, jails were never designed to be mental health treatment facilities. However, there are 10 times as many mentally ill people in jails and prisons than there are in all of the country's long-term psychiatric facilities combined. Why? This topic really deserves its own episode, but the main reason is that mental health services are dramatically underfunded. This is true at every level of the treatment continuum. Community mental health centers are poorly funded at the state and federal level. The US has cut so much funding for mental health care that we've lost 96% of our state psychiatric beds. And even independent clinicians are now taking cash payments for services because insurance reimbursement rates are so low. Long story short, the mental health care system in the US is just not set up to care for people with serious mental illness. Because of this, jails, which are supposed to be the treatment provider of last resort, are now the largest mental health facilities in the country. Instead of doctors and therapists, police and corrections officers are now the most common first responders for mental health emergencies. So I work at a jail. There are only 2 facilities with more mental health patients than my jail in a 50-mile radius. And guess what they are? One is a prison, and the other is another jail. I've already mentioned what it's like in jail. It's noisy, chaotic, and turnover is high. On top of this, you're going to have more mental health patients than a community psychiatric hospital, and you're going to have fewer mental health staff to diagnose and treat them. And you're going to have to do it quickly, often with no background or medical paperwork on your patient. Your patients are going to be handcuffed when they talk to you, and they're going to be living in an environment with people who are either more savvy than they are, if they're in general population, or surrounded by people who are psychotic and screaming or banging on the walls, if they're in the designated mental health section. It's hard to imagine how someone gets better in an environment like this. I'll go into how we try to do this in our next episode. Before we wrap it up, I just want to touch on 2 topics briefly because they're going to be relevant later. First, recidivism. Recidivism means that a person is convicted of a crime, serves his sentence, and is then later convicted of another crime. This is a super important concept to understand because high rates of recidivism tell us that there is a mismatch between the problems people have and the tools the justice system uses to respond to them. The last topic I want to touch on is competence. In the US, you cannot put someone through a trial or let them take a plea deal if they are considered not competent. That is, they either do not understand their charges, do not understand the consequences of a plea or a conviction, or they are incapable of aiding in their defense. In order for someone to be found incompetent, the court will order 2 disinterested clinicians, usually psychiatrists or psychologists, to evaluate the inmate and give an opinion to the court. There are also some instances in which you can get away with just 1 competence evaluation, and some where you might need 3 evaluations, but 2 is the standard. If these clinicians deem the inmate incompetent, then the inmate will have to participate in competence restoration, which is usually, but not always, done at a state psychiatric hospital. We'll do a whole episode on competence restoration another time, but the reason I'm mentioning it now is that it's important to understand how long this process takes. The person first has to be identified as potentially incompetent. This might not happen until the person has already been in the jail for a month or 2. Then the judge has to order the evaluation, which could take a month to complete. Then the person has to be ordered to the state hospital and wait in line for a hospital bed. This part varies wildly depending on what state you live in, but you're typically looking at 2 months or more for a forensic bed. I won't point fingers, but there are some states where the wait for a state psychiatric bed is 6 months or more. Then the person has to be at the hospital until competence can be restored. In my experience, this usually takes about 3 months, but I've seen it happen as fast as 30 days or as long as 4 years. Then, once competence is restored, the inmate has to come back to jail so that they can continue with their court case. So if you do the math here, you have 1 month to be identified, 1 month for the report to be filed, 2 months to wait for a hospital bed, 3 months for competence to be restored, and then you come back to the jail and hopefully get on the court docket within a week or 2. Altogether, someone who's deemed incompetent is going to spend at least 7 months tangled up in this system, and that's if everything goes smoothly. you can see how just being mentally ill can cause you to spend more time locked up than your average inmate. So, like I said, we'll talk a lot more about competence in a future video. In our next episode, we will shift our focus from the legal side to the clinical side. We'll talk about what mental illness looks like in a jail, who provides treatment, and what type of care can realistically be provided in the conditions we've discussed. That's all the time we have for our session today. I'll see you next week.